This is entry 13 for Thursday, March 12th, 1964. It's a two-page entry. Go ahead and set the scene for us.
Well, the first item in the entry relates to a meeting with CIA representatives, obviously to discuss what materials they were going to produce for our consideration and what their views were on other aspects of our investigation. Attending these meetings with Rankin was one of my basic assignments. I attended virtually all of the meetings with agency representatives, FBI, CIA, Treasury, and usually wrote memos with respect to those meetings for the record. In this case, it doesn't identify who was present. It probably was at the offices of the Commission rather than at the CIA headquarters. I have a vivid recollection of my first meeting at the CIA when I was accompanied by Mr. Dulles, and it was significant because as we entered the building, it was clear that everyone who saw former Director Dulles came over to pay their respects, and that he was just warmly regarded by everyone in the agency. Here, it reflects my favorable impression of the CIA, which I expressed perhaps with too much enthusiasm, because I said in the last sentence that they seem to have they seem to be good specialists. They're smart, they're articulate, and they seem to have a broad view of government. Quote, "This may be, of course, because they do not have any special axe to grind in the Commission's investigation." End of quote. That's a sentence that should have been struck if it were striking to be done, because obviously the CIA had a major axe at the grind, namely to conceal the Castro assassination planning that had been ongoing since 1960, of which former Director Dulles knew a good deal and may indeed have remained sufficiently in contact with his former colleagues to be almost current as to what was going on, if anything. In fact, the record seems to tend to support the proposition that these planning efforts stopped in early 1963 at the request of President Kennedy and the National Security official McGeorge Bundy, who were exploring a back channels means for communicating with Castro and avoiding any future conflicts. And those matters have been written about extensively, and some quite well written and well reviewed books. But the point here is that we thought and continued to think in the future that they had an obligation to inform us of these plans, because they might have been used in elaborating and extending our investigation to explore possible contacts between Oswald and Ubi and some of the relatively diverse and criminally oriented persons that the CIA was dealing with in thinking through these assassination plots. So the CIA generally had provided some very useful memos. David Slauson, who was by nature a very friendly and thoughtful and collegial individual, had established good working relationships with, I think it was Ray Rocca, who was the CIA agent that was designated to be principal liaison with the Warren Commission. And David reached the point where he and Rocca were able to talk over the phone and talk about some matters in production of some materials that did not have to be the subject of official correspondence. So at this stage, the relations with the CIA were good. They also made the recommendation, I think at a subsequent meeting, which it did include Helms, that if we wanted to know more about the Mexico trip, perhaps we just ought to send some representatives to Mexico City for that purpose. But on the whole, the CIA agents were what I said in this memo. They were articulate, they were thoughtful, they seemed to be concerned for contributing to our work, and their shortcomings were disclosed more fully in subsequent years.
And you can't underestimate the significance of those revelations, because when that came out in the 70s, that is one of the key factors that ushered in the House Select Committee on Assassinations investigation. Hypothetically, is it possible that Dulles confided in the Chief Justice some of this information, and then for whatever reason the Chief Justice decided not to make it apparent to Rankin or you or anyone else?
I think that's quite unlikely, but I don't know. I think Dulles obviously made a decision, as did his colleagues, that there was nothing that any reasonable investigator would find between these assassination plots and what the commission was doing. But of course, that was not supposed to be their decision to make. And I'm confident that they made this decision, and I don't think they would have felt comfortable in telling the Chief Justice that, because it would have put him in a very difficult place. And in fact, we know from developments in 1967, when the Drew Pearson story, published by Jack Anderson, reported on these assassination attempts because of their connection with someone who was personally involved from outside the agency, that it precipitated concern on Warren's part, and he went to visit with the president about it. And the records of that meeting in 1967 between the president and the Chief Justice demonstrate that this is the first time the Chief Justice was informed. So I think that provides for a more definitive answer to your question. And it was perhaps as a result of that revelation, it was also the first time the president learned about these assassinations, and he was given an oral report by then Director Helms, and there was no written document with respect to those assassination plots that ever came to the attention of an investigative or congressional committee until 1975 with the Rockefeller Commission.
The second section of this memo is again about preparing for bringing in witnesses to testify. You do mention bringing in the doctors early because of the Chief Justice's desire. We talked about that a moment ago. You do say, as a result, I'm not optimistic that the doctor's testimony will be as complete or persuasive as it might be. Again, is that just because things were going a little faster than you were prepared for?
It is, and as we know, with respect to the doctor's testimony, they had to, in the absence of certain of the materials, they had a Navy corpsman draw a figure and simulate where the bullets penetrated the president, and it was inadequately done. It didn't reflect careful scrutiny, and though there's no reason to think that with more time we might have been able to evade that problem. But anyway, it's indicative of the risks that you take in the course of preparing witnesses to testify in a matter of this importance.
The last section is actually quite poignant. You talk about going to the Attorney General's house, Robert Kennedy's home, and I think you want to read a little bit of this this last paragraph to us.
This was an event at the Attorney General's house to which I and my wife were invited. It was attended by somewhere near 100 people. It was to celebrate the final judgment in the Hoffa trial, and to acknowledge the contributions that these people made, whether they were investigators, marshals, lawyers who tried the case, support staff, just a wide range of people participate in an investigation, prosecution, and trial of this significance. I knew most of the people present there, and there was the sense of common commitment and sharing of the experience of a kind that is quite memorable. After all, the Attorney General had suffered this enormous loss in his life. He had continued to function as an Attorney General, and and to supervise these kinds of decisions. And I say that there also he was given an award. Walter Sheridan, whom I mentioned recently, a close friend of gave the Attorney General a book containing the jury verdict and signatures. And so my entry goes on to say, quote, "The Attorney General, I think, was very much a part of the evening and enjoyed it. I think this is the sort of environment he feels most comfortable in these lonely days in the midst of a group of men who have worked so hard toward goals which he shares. In accepting the gift, he spoke shortly and very sensitively of his concern that unless Hoffa had been convicted, the Teamsters Union would have developed into a political and an economic force that would have succeeded the power of the federal government. In speaking of the group and thanking everyone, he spoke humorously of the time when Walter, quote, a non-lawyer, would get on the phone and advise him what the next legal step should be. And he, the Attorney General, always told Walter that he and Walt should go get themselves a couple of lawyers to advise them. During the course of his remarks, the Attorney General made reference to, quote, the President, unquote, looking down on this effort and being a part of it. And it was certainly very clear to the group that he was speaking of his brother. This, plus the sight of the Attorney General by himself looking over the notebook of signatures, gave a poignant and emotional tone to the evening which it is hard to forget, end quote.
You were a delegate at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. This might be a good moment to briefly reflect on that if you'd like.
Yes, actually I was thinking of that because of some of the reported news that two of Robert Kennedy's sons have gone public again with respect to the opinion that their father did not accept the conclusions of the Warren Commission report. And my response to that is, of course, that I'm sad that they have that opinion. And I wonder really what the basis is, because I think that Bob Kennedy did ultimately accept the conclusions. First of all, he was, when he left the department, he wrote me a very generous note thanking me for my participation in the work of the department. But I thought that in the immediate year or so after the report came out, I think and have reason to believe that he did seek from Walter Sheridan and from others assurances from time to time about the report. And Walter Sheridan became an active investigative journalist for NBC, and in 1967 did a program based on the Garrison prosecution in New Orleans, and demonstrated with specific and graphic detail what a dishonest effort that was. And I think Walter Sheridan was a confidant of the Attorney General, and would have told him if there were any flaws in the Warren Commission report that deserved attention by the Attorney General or anyone representing him. I do not think the Attorney General would have invited me to be a delegate on his convention, a delegation that had to go face to face with a Humphrey slate in the District of Columbia. It actually was one of the only primaries in which there was a Humphrey slate. Humphrey did not engage in any politicking through the primary system, although he was being challenged by McCarthy and then later by Bob Kennedy. So it was an extraordinary experience, because we had about 21 people. It was equally divided between African Americans and white community lawyers, physicians. The chairman was a black minister in the District of Columbia. It was and remains the most productive interracial program in which I ever have been involved in the District of Columbia. As soon as I was, we prevailed in the election. And as soon as it was designated that we were going to go, the chairman asked me to go on the Rules Committee of the convention, which, among other chores, has to evaluate the rules under which the delegation was assembled in 1968. And as soon as my name was submitted as a member of the Rules Committee, I was called by a woman from Connecticut named Ann Wexler, whose husband was an active politician. And Ms. Wexler had a McCarthy supporter, had undertaken to staff and bring to fruition a Democratic committee determined to revise the rules of the convention so that it would not be so dominated by politicians who were attending the convention because they had been elected to serve in some other capacity, perhaps 12 or 18 months earlier. So and primaries were a rarity, so there was a need to have a more diverse attendance, where there adequate representation for women, African Americans, and other minorities. There was a need to restrict the time frame within which people could be designated to come to the convention. And there were other rules that were being forwarded in this commission report for attention of the Rules Committee. So she asked me whether I would participate in this effort when I met her I think she was a delegate at the convention. And I said, of course. And those of us who supported the reform were primarily McCarthy supporters. Some of us former Kennedy supporters, now that he was no longer a candidate, and a single Humphrey supporter who was a young Democratic Party boss from Buffalo, and a truly engaging person. In any event, there were about 35 of us who favored this support on a commission, on a committee of about 102 or thereabouts. And under the rules of the convention, a report could go forward if it was supported by a third of the committee. And we did have the third. But as we achieved the third, Ann Wexler turned to me and said, well, it's going to the floor. Do you think we'll prevail? And I said, no. And she said, why? She said, you drafted it. And I said, yes, I drafted it because you wanted an issue to present to the committee, not because you actually thought it was going to come to fruition. I said, the committee has passed a resolution obligating state Democratic parties to change their rules to accomplish the objectives I've identified in terms of gender, timing, and so forth. And in some states, state legislation would not permit partisan organizations to adopt such rules. So she said, well, what can we do about that? Well, I said, you change the language from saying shall require to make all reasonable attempts to achieve those objectives. And so we made the change in the text of the resolution. It passed on the floor of the convention, and no one noticed that there was a change in the statement recommendation being voted on from the recommendation that had been approved by the committee. And that led to subsequently a Democratic committee a committee examination of implementing this rule. And some people, to make the story shorter, say resulted in the devastating loss of McGovern in the 1972 convention. I think, on the whole, the reform of the rules had long-standing effect, and I think it was something that Bob Kennedy would have endorsed.